Right, so we're doing something a little bit different today. A couple of weeks ago I came out here to this monumental parts yard. There's acres upon acres of it on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, just inside Pennsylvania in fact. And I found some interesting cars. We're going to take a look at some of those again today, but we didn't cover all of it before, so we're going to have a look around and see what we can find and talk about them. For instance, there's a whole row of Ford Fiesta Mark 6s here, for instance, including a top spec early SES model with the really nice alloy wheels, and those look to be in nice shape as well. That's a car I would love to have. Not that one, but if I had a Fiesta, then this is just a gold mine. Obviously these are all wrecks, they're all written off. All the fluids have been taken out of them, all the batteries have been taken out of them, but I did buy some parts for my van that are quite hard to get, and I intend doing that with for some of my other cars as well. So I think this place could prove to be a good source of bits and bobs. Anyway, what we're going to do today is have a look around and see if there's anything that's really interesting that we can find. I've always found this kind of content on YouTube to be quite interesting, and so having the opportunity to do this is, I think, quite refreshing. I'm Darren Walker and this is Auto Atlantica. So all of the Mark 6 Fiestas in the United States had a choice of the 1 litre 3-cylinder EcoBoost or a 1.6, and I think it's the 1.6 that's in this. This is an early SES model, which was the top spec. I've always thought that these alloys in particular are really nice. This probably has a leather interior, leatherette interior at least, and it does. On the early Mark 6s, the US cars had slightly extended bumpers because, unlike the European cars, they have to cope with 1.5 mile an hour side impacts as well, or offset impacts. So you can see that beam that's designed to do that, as well as the 2.5 mile an hour front impact. Now that meant that the bumper was redesigned. On the US cars, there are no fog lights on these early ones. You just got these LED strips, and they were on the SES. The moulding was sort of like a chrome effect surrounding them, so quite interesting. I've always liked them. So here we've got a Ford C-Max, of course, based on the Focus. The C-Max only came to the United States as a hybrid, and I think there may have been a plug-in version as well, but there were no diesel or regular petrol models here. Now, initially, the Grand C-Max, which had the sliding rear doors, and I think they were 7-seaters in Europe, was going to come to the States. But Ford changed its product planning for North America at the last minute, and it just went with the regular one instead. But you can see here the hybrid motor. I'm going to try not to sort of poke my feet on anything. There's the hybrid motor there. Obviously it's got this big acoustic cover on it. But you can get these relatively inexpensive now, and next to it is an EcoSport. They've got several EcoSports down here. I can see at least 4 or 5. This one looks like it's more of a top spec model. It's an SES, which was the top spec model before it was replaced with titanium. Same with the Fiesta as well. These are, of course, Fiesta based. They're built in India. And that has had a prang. It's set off all the airbags, and that's a real nice trim in this one. So I've got a couple of Pontiac G6 coupes here. There's some regular sedans on the other side. The coupe was interesting simply because it had a revised rear end, and GM's twin top system that it put on the Astra H in Europe, it also used for, and the Tigra I think it was on as well, it also used the same system for this, the coupe version of the G6. Now, as with the Satinora, these sat on the same extended Epsilon platform as the Opel Vectra estate in Europe. So that's why it has this sort of like enormous wheelbase that's on the coupe, and it just looks too long for a coupe, so the proportions were a little bit weird. Right, so here we've got a Cadillac CTS second generation, but the coupe. And the coupe was one of my favourites because it really accentuated that art and science design theme that Cadillac was using at the time. Really was an absolutely epic car. Really sad to see it in this sort of condition, but there you go. Makes good parts for other ones. This is a 1991 Mercury Capri. It's actually built as a Ford Capri in Australia, but it's completely Mazda based on the 323, I believe. I think they all had a 2-litre engine, but this actually started out as the Gear Barchetta concept car in the sort of early 1980s. And Ford didn't really do much with it because that was actually based on the Fiesta, but they took the design cues of it and put it into production in this. And as I said, it was made in Australia, brought over to the States as a Mercury. So this one, as you can see here, I'll have a look inside, it's completely stripped out, sadly, but they've actually got 3 of these things here. They've all been stripped out because people obviously want the interiors. But a fascinating find nonetheless. You just don't see these on the road anymore. So we've got a very early second generation Ford Probe here, based on the Mazda MX-6. It used 2 Mazda engines as well, a 2-litre 4 and a 2.5-litre V6. These are such underrated cars. I had one, a UK spec one, in white as well. These aren't original wheels, these are Mazda wheels, but this is an early US car because it has the license plate in between the lights. They later went down into the bumper as the European models were. These drive beautifully. They're not really so much of a sports car as like a Grand Tourer, and I took mine to various parts of Europe. What's interesting about these is that on the European cars, because of European safety regulations, pedestrian anti-impaling rules, the doors for the pop-up headlights came to about here, and there's a fill-in panel on there, but for the rest of the world had the full length doors instead, which I always thought looked cleaner. Ford Taurus, so 3rd generation car. This is no ordinary Taurus, it's an SHO. These wheels might look a bit small, but they are original, they've just been painted. And now this particular generation of Taurus was a real jelly mold, and it was very controversial at the time. Some people just thought it was just too way out as far as the looks were concerned, but other people really loved it. It's a real Marmite car. But the SHO was really interesting because it had the Yamaha developed small block V8. It was like a 3.4 litre V8 that was in this thing. I'll put a horsepower number on the screen, but just a very, very curious car in my opinion, and one that's a shame to see sort of like languishing in a breaker's yard. This one's a 99. Now, amongst all the newer metal that's here, there are some golden oldies as well. And when I say golden oldies, I'm going back to the 1970s with this Mark II Mustang. After the oil crisis, of course, in 1973, Ford really reduced the size and the engine sizes of its Mustang, and it came up with this, and everybody hated it. It wasn't a real Mustang. Now, where have you heard that before? So, but it was very maligned, but there were some beefier versions produced in its later years, particularly in the fastback guys. But this is just a base gear. Ford was using the gear moniker as a trim level over here very briefly at the time. It used it extensively in Europe for several decades. And I just think it's interesting to find this one sort of languishing in a yard. This one probably has the 3.3 litre V6, I'm guessing. Oh, it's a 2.8. It says right there. This is looks like a very early first generation car, probably 65, 66. The Mark 1 Mustangs just increasingly got bigger as that generation went along, and it was built until 1973, when it was pretty much a pastiche of the very first cars. It was almost unrecognisable. Then we've got a fourth generation car. This is the fourth generation car, yeah, but it's a later fourth generation car. Ford was inspired by their new edge design in the late 1990s, and so the very sort of roundish design cues on the fourth generation car were replaced by these very angular, blocky front and rear lights, which I thought was more attractive. Yeah, this one's a 2000 model. There's an earlier third generation convertible here. That one looks like it's a later car, because in the mid 80s they changed the styling a little bit in the mid 80s and put the flush composite lights on. And here's an early fourth generation car here with the earlier lights, which were a much more sort of like rounded affair. These to me didn't really have that much appeal, but the updated one, which is another one here in the late 90s, I thought was just a much more cohesive design, even though it's essentially the same car. That one is an 01, so one of the very later ones. I find this particularly interesting, and I would really love one of these in my collection actually. This is a Mitsubishi Miev. It's a small electric vehicle, very early electric vehicle technology from around 2010 or so. It was only available as an EV in the United States. It's a bit of a late addition actually compared with other countries, when it came out I think in like 06, 07, with petrol engines too. This was at a very early tie-up between PSA, so there were Citroën and Peugeot versions of this car in Europe too, but only the EV came to the US. It was extensively redesigned. The bumper design at the front and rear was slightly extended for those offside regulations again, and the wiper pattern, because the US regulates how much of the screen has to be swept. This is a 1994 Diamante, known internationally as the Sigma, built in Australia. And these are beautiful cars to drive. I have driven one many years ago. 3-litre V6 if I recall in these. In the US it was offered as a wagon as well as a sedan, and the wagons are particularly rare, but just really beautiful cars. If I remember rightly, these were derived from the Galant, and I think these just had a slightly longer wheelbase, but yeah, fantastic car. Pontiac. So this is a Dodge Stealth, essentially the same car as the Mitsubishi 3000 GT. If I'm not, this is a 93, if I remember rightly, the Dodge had a wider variety of engines in the US market. But otherwise, apart from some styling changes front and rear, pretty much the same. I personally preferred the looks of the Dodge version, especially in the lower trims without all the extra ground effects, because I just thought the design looked beautiful. I've always wanted one. You can pick these up, road going ones, relatively inexpensive still as well. But what's interesting on the Dodge version, it's rather like the old RX-7. These are obviously pop-up headlights, but these clear panels in the front allowed you to actually flash the headlights without raising them. I do think that these later cars, this is an early later car, had the same sort of like moulding and grille moulding as the Galant, on which it's based. This is more of a base car. This is probably a GS, not a GT. This one looks like, Yeah, it's a GS, I think, as well. But this is one of the last of the line. This one, a lot of the parts on it look like they're in good shape still. Headlights look perfect, actually. So, sad to see. But anyway, let's move on. This is a curiosity, the Suzuki Aereo. It was like a tall sort of hatchback, sort of like a very early sort of like small MPV, if you will. It had a different name in Europe and it's completely escaped me, so I'll flash it up on the screen. But interesting little car, it's quite narrow compared with its width. I really couldn't tell you much about it other than that, but there's one here. When Chrysler bought AMC in 1987, it rebranded its existing Renaults, or the ones that were left, as Eagles. And because Chrysler had the tie-in with Mitsubishi, it decided to call its version of the Mitsubishi vehicles that it produced Eagles as well. And this is one of them. This is the Talon, and it's basically their version of the Mitsubishi Eclipse. And they built it in the first two generations. By the time the third generation Eclipse, that's this one, came out in the late 90s, the whole Diamond Star, as they called it, agreement had fallen apart. So, but yeah, this is part of an agreement between Chrysler and Mitsubishi that went back into the early 1980s. But an Eagle Talon is probably the one that I would want. There were slight styling differences, particularly at the back, but this shape is my favourite Eclipse. So a big thanks indeed to Feezle's Auto Wreckers of Enon Valley in Pennsylvania for their cooperation with this video. Apologies for some of the sound problems that we've had. Part 2 coming soon.